Come on in, sit down, please. You know you're someplace where people care about you when they put out a cup of water with your initial on it just so that you can do your talk. This has never, ever happened before. Okay, I'm going to carry this with me because I'm not very good at staying still. So my name's Dan Perunko. How many folks, and I'm sorry for the people online that I can't see you raise your hand, but how many people have been in a talk with me before, a class or a conference or something? So it's about half the people in this classroom. As I was listening this morning, I was thinking about this process of trying to describe high-performance HVAC systems and teaching all these classes and people being excited about it and then going back to their world. And I eventually came to, I feel kind of like that Greek character that rolls the boulder up the hill and then the boulder goes down the hill and you roll the boulder back up the hill. And so the question is, how many of you have adopted these practices into your HVAC companies already? Right? Because I mean, this is not actually new. This is something we've been talking about for years and years. So completely adopted, I got about 3 or 4 hands. Completely adopted, or just a couple of things, or cool. Thank you. So I got one Mark. I'm not going to say last names because I don't know how I'm supposed to do that. But a gentleman raised his hand and said that since 2010, he had adopted all of the practices on this list already. So if that's the case, and you manage to feed 10 jobs through this company, or through this process, you get 12 grand, if I did the math right, right? Like, so this is a cool thing for folks that have decided that these practices make sense. And if I say anything about a program, assume that I could be wrong because I don't do that part. All right, anybody else adopted all of this or just something? The high performance practices. You do them.
Yeah, I mean, that's taking your class. I think you took on
most of them. Okay, good. So I think, listening to people talk, there's always this, well, can I still get the rebate if I can't seal the duct leakage? No. I mean, these things, like, we should be working towards these things being normal. And of course, there will be situations where you can't hit all of them, and that happens to me as well. I had a job that I thought was really kind of a drag. We put a 3-ton system on a 3,000 square foot house, and to me that's too big. But we couldn't fix the house enough to reduce the size, and so the equipment is larger than I would like it to be. That happens to all of us within some boundaries, but I don't expect to be rewarded for that. Like, this should be our new normal. So if you want to hunt me down later, here's my contact information. It'll be available to you again. This is the matrix that we were talking about. I think that these are reasonable practices. Number 2 is the one that I think we have phenomenal resistance to in our sort of contracting culture. And I don't completely understand why. I mean, there's a lot of fear of houses not being able to recover, salesmen being paid in some way related to the cost or size of the equipment. I don't understand what the obstacle is, but it's really hard for us to meet our energy efficiency, savings, and comfort goals with oversized equipment, especially in this climate. Right? And so it has to happen.
Yeah, you can't just install a smaller system without doing other steps.
That depends on what you compare it to. If you're comparing it to a reasonably accurate load calc for that building, then sure, that's a logical statement. If you're comparing it to the industry's practices, what is normal in my second example, the way we do things now, is done so badly that it's not a good comparison. But I can do 800 square feet per ton on mediocre buildings. I can do 1,500 square feet per ton on good buildings, right? And so right now we're just nowhere close. This is just about heating systems, because there's a group of contractors that don't do much air conditioning, and they have asked repeatedly, can we be in the program? We really don't install air conditioning. We need to be able to demonstrate that the competencies are there to do a system that has heat and air conditioning. So Torsten showed a slide earlier that said your initial submissions have to have both, but then we'll figure out a way to do this for heat-only systems. The rubbing point is the, in number 5, this is 85% of performance for air conditioning or a heat pump. With gas equipment, it's that much harder to do the math for this because you're trying to track gas and electric. But I think we'll come up with something, and again, this is not decided, something like 80% of nominal capacity. But we're going to have to be able to, we can use the same procedure to measure output, but we haven't settled on what that number will be. But we're going to figure this out so that heat-only systems can be in the program. This is the data sheet. You should be groaning, right? Like, I do this kind of thing, and when Mike McFarland and Rick Chitwood developed this, they sent it off, and I'm like, okay, you know, there's just a lot of little boxes to fill out. But conceptually, it's not, none of these are hard measurements. It's about becoming familiar with this form. And the good news is you guys have been in these programs, and there's all kinds of weird stuff to fill out. So being able to overcome a form should be something we can manage. So you're collecting, right? I mean, this part you've got lots of training on. We should be able to manage this process. And so you're collecting, you know, data about the building, data about the size of the heating and cooling equipment, and then data about the airflow and the temperature split. And we're calculating delivered BTUs to the building. And so if you have an attic system and you have 20% losses in the attic, your system's not going to qualify. Right? We have to manage getting the energy from the equipment to the building at better than 85% for air conditioning in order for this to work. And it's 85% sensible. So if you're a big piece of equipment and you're pulling a lot of moisture out of the air, again, you're not going to qualify. Right? So sizing is important. Burying the ducts in insulation will make your life much easier if you can do it. And all of that data gets recorded in here, and this is how we figure out if you comply. There's a chart, oops, wrong button, sorry. There's a chart right here that gives you an idea about sizing. And so I just realized that I'm pointing again and the people online can't see it. So right-hand side, about halfway down, system sizing and required performance reference table. So if you had a 2,000 to 2,399 square foot house, your AC system has to be 2.5 tons or smaller, and your heating has to be 36,000 BTU input or smaller, which is hard. How many systems, can anybody buy a 36,000 BTU input system? No, right? Like this is where it gets tricky. We'll have to sort out acceptable solutions. All of this is much, much easier with heat pumps. We still have the same rules around fuel switching and all of the program stuff, so we're going to have to figure out how to do this in a gas scenario unless you went, it would be easy if you went to hydronic forced air, which a lot of contractors don't want to do because it's unfamiliar. Furnaces are going to be tricky in smaller houses. There are some small furnaces out there, but not a ton. This is the second page of that same data sheet. As you're working through collecting airflows and temperatures, you fill out this side. Has anybody ever seen this before? I got one nod. So when you're measuring airflow, you use a flow hood typically, and we usually just read the number off the flow hood and say, that's great, that's our airflow. It turns out when you're defining how much energy a system is moving, you can't just read the airflow, you have to correct it for temperature. All of those calculations are done with air under standard conditions, which is a certain temperature and at a certain altitude. And so we have to correct for that before we can do the energy calculation, which means that your airflow has to be really good. If it's, say, like where I work, at the top of this chart, go up to you know, like 4,000 feet and 80 degrees, I lose 9% of my airflow. So my measured airflow is 1,000, I have to drop it by 90, and then I feed it into my calculations, which means my energy output through the system is going to calc lower than if I hadn't done that calculation, right? But this is the proper way to do this sort of delivered BTU calculation, and it's in our procedure, so we're doing it. Fortunately, a lot of you don't work up that high, and so, oops, sorry, wrong button again. You know, if you're at the lower elevations, you can get a tiny little bonus up to about 2,000 square feet. It's not, or 2,000 feet of elevation, it's not too bad. So it depends a little on where we're working. There's a document that describes, and I'm going to jump back a bunch of slides so that I can point at, oops, that was not, I didn't want to go that far. Okay, so on the right-hand side where it says verification methods, those methods all have to be done following a procedure and with proper equipment. And so that corresponds to this document. And it's a multi-page document. It says what the procedures are. It says which pieces of equipment we can use. I suspect that we're going to do an update to this soon because one of the pieces of equipment has changed. I know that, and possibly the program people didn't because I'm not a full-time staff person. So I'm telling you, we probably have to make a change. There's a newer flow capture device on the market that should qualify for this. There's a device called the Flow Blaster that the Energy Conservatory made, which is great, but they screwed up. The batteries are bad, and so they stopped making it. And so that was the sort of the best piece of equipment when this was written. So I think we'll broaden the acceptable pieces of equipment for this. But the, you know, the big flow hood that the HERS raters all use, it won't qualify. It's not accurate enough. And so that kind of stuff will be in this document. So why do I get to be up here? Because we're still back in this place, right? The boulder keeps rolling back down the hill. The HVAC industry is not turning out a product that's getting us what we want. And you guys represent people who are trying and have had successes to varying degrees, right? And so that's good, but overall we still have this problem. And then the rebate and incentive program, it didn't get us there, right? Like we modeled all this savings and we didn't realize it. And so something has to change. And that's kind of what the whole beginning of this conversation was about. And then, of course, you can get pretty much anything past code. Like I know it doesn't always feel like that's true, but code is not getting us a big change in delivered efficiency for homeowners. Right? So there might be that a particular install detail is required and it's a real pain in the neck. But the amount of waste in our forced air systems isn't significantly better by virtue of the code changes we've made so far. Right? We need to do better. Does that feel fair? Anybody feel picked on? Like you guys are kind of like ringers, right? If I had a bigger audience, I'm sure somebody would be annoyed at me at this point. Which is kind of the point. Because I get to teach these classes, I get to meet all kinds of people. And there was this guy in class, and he said, you know, the sizing criteria you keep talking about, they don't seem right. You know, I've never heard anything like that before. And I said, no, a bunch of us are doing it. It works. We can prove it. I'm 100% certain that this is true. And I said, why don't you go back and look at the data? Because, you know, the CEC's got all this data from permits and HERS ratings and all that stuff. And go see what's going on. Tell me if what's coming in to the office is any good. Because they sort of all believe that they're busy making code and making rules, and it's, pretty good. And so this guy actually did it, and he sent me this data set. It's not very big, but it's super fun and kind of depressing. So 70% of the systems in his data set were 50% or more oversized. The average sizing of the oversized systems was 177% of our target. That's If you pull then AC systems out by themselves, you're 163% oversized. Of the total sample of 23 systems, 16 of the 23 were at least 150% oversized, right? So, like, what are we happy about? Why are we proud of ourselves? Like, and maybe you're not doing this and you get to be proud of yourself, but as an industry, yay for us, right? Like, this sucks.
At least they got permits.
And these are permitted, right? And that's part of the argument I've been having with these folks at the CEC. Like, the permitting in and of itself is largely meaningless at this point. We're not making the changes we need to make by virtue of requiring permits. So, soapbox aside, what do we have to do? This is the same stuff we've been talking about for years now. You adopted it a long time ago. You adopted it a long time ago. You guys have adopted it, which is great. We just need to continue moving this direction. Forced air heating and cooling systems can be thought about by 6 basic principles. And you'll see that these kind of line up with the program requirements. They were thought of by the same guy, right? Years and years and years ago, I said to Rick Chitwood, how do I figure out how to talk about and evaluate HVAC systems? And he said, oh, there's this article I wrote. Here, read it. It's called Performance Factors for HVAC. And it listed 7 things and a design target and a way to test it. I'm like, oh, this is great. And it's just a super simple, extremely effective way to look at what we do. So, duct leakage, 3% of nominal flow, right? That's 50% improvement over code. In this program, you'll actually have to have an airflow, whereas in code, you can kind of not have the nominal airflow and still get credit somehow, right? So, is this a hard target, 3%?
No.
No, this is way too easy. Like, contractors that are doing nothing else right are already doing 3% or better. Contractors who just aren't paying attention at all are struggling with this, and it showed up in that data set that there were a bunch of things that didn't qualify, but this is easy. Use mastic, right? Done. Use a lot of mastic, even better, right? This is not hard.
I know a story about mastic.
Okay, I've been coached that I let people talk too much and I'll blow my time slot, so you have to do it fast.
In 2013, we did a house in Baltimore, I think, built in 1996. You were looking there at the duct system and the back one at the time. When I was up there doing the duct leakage and looking at the air conditioner recurrence, he had a demo over it, and it was one of the only ones that I had seen at the time that was using mastic. Everybody else had been using duct tape. And so we went down to the duct leakage test. We got 2.9%. So that was like 16 years after the fact, and he had still had 2.9%.
Nice.
And at the time, Tower 24 was 6% on new construction, so I was targeting 6% duct leakage. But when I got that 2.9, I knew with mastic that we could get to 3. So I started targeting 3. The contractors that we were working with at the time were getting 1 and 2% on average using mastic. So it definitely helps.
So for the folks online, I was slow with the microphone. The beginning of that story was that the gentleman was testing homes in a development, and they had been the systems had been built with mastic. And so they tested well at 3% or better, and then at a period of time later, they also tested well. So effective and durable is the upshot of that story. And as a sort of contracting culture piece, using percentages is really dumb. We all do it because that's what we've been trained to do. It's so much easier when you say, okay, I'm going to do this duct blaster test, and it's going to give me a number of CFM of leakage. I'm never going to let that number be higher than something. Right? And so my company uses 25. It goes right in our work scopes. Duct leakage will not be higher than 25 CFM. All systems should pass code at that number, right? And it gives me a hard target that is never flexible. If I do a 5-ton system, which I've never done, but theoretically I could, I would still do 25 CFM of leakage. If I do a 1-ton system, I don't know, can I still do 1 ton? Yeah, I could. I've got a half hour left. I should be okay. So a hard target is the way to do this, internally. Okay, so that next piece about ducts run as short as possible and low in attics is just about thermal losses, right? Thermal losses are huge in our climate because we do about the dumbest thing you could possibly do. We put HVAC systems on roofs and in attics, right? And I'm not saying we're dumb. It's just kind of hard not to at this point because that's how all of these buildings were built. We have millions of these, right? So it's our job to improve them to the sort of ultimate level we can get away with because this is the worst way you could do this, right? Like you can't find more harsh conditions to put a duct system in than the attic of the building, right? So we have to be really careful about how we do it. So this is a mathematical calculation assuming 2,000 square foot house, assuming 40% surface area of the duct system, which is the average relationship between ducts and floor area. And if you do the calculation for attic temperatures and R6 ducts, we're looking at 0.89 tons of loss capacity, right? And in this climate, you would do R8 ducts by code now. There's still, I think, maybe some coastal climates where you can get away with R6. Never use R6. It's crazy, right? Like, find the way to get the customer to pay for R8 and then bury that. Because a third of the capacity of a 3-ton system can be lost just to hot ducts. Why would you give that away? Or, if you thought about it like this, if you fix this piece, you can reduce the size of the equipment by 30%, right? Which makes it easier to comply with the program. And better for your homeowner. They get better air quality, and they get lower bills and increased comfort. Why did I say better air quality? Ducts are sealed, but it's directly related to equipment size. Runtime. So California has some of the worst air quality in the nation for particulate matter, right? Farming and traffic and fires and everything else. How do you get particulate out of the air? With a filter. You can run the system so that it filters the air all the time and then have a massive air conditioner kick on and off once in a while to offset the load you're creating by doing that. Or you can run a tiny little conditioning system with a big filter at high airflow and get free filtration. It's up to you. We should be selling air quality. And if you sell air quality right now, people will buy it. Has anybody gone outside this summer or last summer? Right? It's not a hard sell. Small equipment will do a better job for you. I didn't do that. I don't think. Hold on. There we go. Okay, so run low in the attic and short as possible. In this instance, sadly, that was short as possible. There's a layout that I couldn't change, and so this big sort of elbow in this duct was unavoidable. We frequently reposition stuff, like abandon one ceiling supply and use a different location to shorten ducts. And this is the same photo. Right? Run low, pull tight, bury it. Crawl space systems. You know there's a furnace in this photo. Did you know that some furnaces can be wrapped in insulation? If you think about it, if you're going to take the hottest thing in the system and put it outside the building enclosure where we'll have the greatest losses, wouldn't it make sense to insulate it? Right? And so what's the deciding factor whether or not you can wrap a furnace in insulation? Because some of you, well, nobody in this room is going to make this mistake. But in theory, you could just leave and wrap a furnace and be in trouble because I said it, right? How do you know? Has anybody ever seen the thing on the label that says clearance to combustibles? If it's 0-inch clearance to combustibles on all 4 sides, you could wrap it in something flammable, in theory, right? I'm not going to, but fiberglass and foil-faced paper, which should be fine. And so we frequently do this. You know, service access is interesting. Okay, there was just a really strange sound in here. Anyway, so service access is interesting. I have an uncle who's an HVAC tech, and I was showing from the East Coast, and I was showing him pictures of our work. And they were like, I wouldn't do that, I wouldn't do that, I wouldn't do that. And it was all about how, you know, he's 70 now and he worked into his 60s. And somewhere along the line, he wasn't bending over for anybody. And so the access became where a 60-year-old guy with a sore back could go without a lot of trouble, which makes some sense, but it's not a great way for us to design houses, right? Like if we centralize the equipment and the tech has got to crawl to it and cut some insulation off and then replace that, but it lowers the people's bills, isn't that the choice we should be making? And then how frequently do we need to do service?
Well, you don't need to do service that much. You just cover it with access panel.
Right. Someone said I don't need to do service that much, which is what I was expecting someone to say. You've got to go twice a year. You have to go twice a year for things that have high pressure and lots of duct leakage and are prone to failure. Things that are well installed and the motor spins at a low RPM and there's not a lot of pressure and the temperature rises right, they go a long time without breaking, right? Unless there's a manufacturer's flaw and then we all get screwed. We eat the labor, they send us parts, and nobody's happy. But that's a small subset of reality. Like we don't need to service stuff constantly to make this work. And so this system in the picture actually has an unsealed insulated flap that can just be lifted over to the top of the furnace. The door is taped closed though, so that part kind of sucks. You got to cut the tape to get the door off.
We do a zipper.
We need a
Where
zipper.
would the filter be?
I've done attic outlets with zippers.
Oh, someone said that there's actually a zipper solution that works on attic, a zip lock.
Zip wall makes it.
Oh, zip wall, using a zip wall for attic hatch. And I had a question in the back.
Yeah, where was the filter located in that system?
In this system, the filter is located at the return grill, which is my preference for filtration because it's easy for homeowners to take on the service themselves. So let me add an addendum to my service tirade. If the homeowner is not going to change the filter or is not able to change the filter, then they need service. Right? That does need to be done. If you use 4-inch pleated filters, it might be once a year instead of every 3 months.
Don't you want those filters as close to the furnace as possible or the air handler as possible? Because if you have a long return duct with potential leaks.
No, I don't. So this is a super simple process in my head. I don't have leaks because I don't allow them to happen. And frequently buried. And then, you know, like I have to go do a service call soon because somebody's dog peed in their duct, right? Occurrences like a rat or a cat or a dog change this model. That's a service call, but it's not normal, right? It's the normal practice is if it's not leaking, it continues to not leak, right? And so well built, well sealed, and you don't have the problem. And in that instance, I want the filter at the beginning so that the whole duct is protected.
And it's more accessible to the homeowner to change.
Right.
Which makes it easier on the equipment.
Absolutely.
It's changed frequently.
Frequently, yeah.
Most all houses I go out to, the filter hasn't, people don't even know where the filter is or.
There is an issue. There is an issue, someone said, that people don't understand that their system even has a filter. And so we do have some education issues. I have yet to have, no, that's not true. I've had very few homeowners that spent a lot of money having us retrofit their house and then just kind of blew off taking care of it. Not none, but very few. On the average, if someone goes down this path and pays the money to have something well installed, they'll generally, you know, and I sell them a case of filters, right, so that they have the option to do this, then they do it. Okay, so this is probably maybe the most difficult one. If we do this properly, temperatures in the house stay within 3 degrees of each other and the thermostat set point when the equipment is running. If they turn it off, all bets are off, right? But if we're conditioning the house, we should be in control of it. And this is part of the test. You're going to measure temperature in multiple rooms, occupied rooms, and at one location you're going to do a foot from the ceiling and a foot from the floor, and they have to show up as all within 3 degrees with the doors open, right? So not actually super hard to do, but it requires that we do duct design and grill design. And so this is kind of where manual J, S, D, and T showed up, right? Like D is about sizing ducts properly. T is about sizing grills properly. I don't actually use T, but I do an engineering procedure to size grills. And what it gets me is throw appropriate for the size of the space and the load on the space. And then mixing is accomplished, and then happens naturally. And this is one of the primary complaints, right? Hot rooms, cold rooms, high bills, and allergies. And so we make this go away by designing the duct system so it includes throw. And that picture is an infrared photo of the effect of a duct in heating. Right? You can see the heat being thrown across the ceiling and impacting the wall. You're not required to do this. Life is so much easier when you do radial design because you put a grill in every location closest to the air handler that needs one, right? So little tiny rooms, we skip them because they don't need to be conditioned. And then you put a damper in each of those ducts and you can be in control of the airflow without it being a really horrible task, right? If you have to balance the airflow by climbing all the way across the building and all the way back to try to adjust dampers, it's difficult. If you skip the dampers, you're just guessing. So that's the same photo as before, and then the effect of a floor register. So this is an engineering chart. I don't know exactly how manual J does the manual T process, but this is the gist of it. What this is showing you is grill sizes on the left, velocities on the top, and then in the rows and columns is a case for each grill, right? So if you pick like an 8x8 grill and 500 feet per minute, it would tell you how many CFM you need to make that happen, and then it would also tell you how far into the room the air is projecting as the air slows down. And so the trick is to get your design airflow through a grill at 500 to 700 feet per minute and have that air hit 25 feet per minute before it hits a person and get 80% of the way across the room. And it sounds complicated, and it is a little, I suppose, but you can get used to this. I've been doing this for years, and I've had a couple of times when I had to go back and change airflow because I was blowing on someone, but mostly this works without a lot of trouble. And it's very effective in terms of mixing the home and controlling temperature. So just so we're clear, you can't use that flow hood. I just didn't have a better picture. I should probably. But we're going to measure supply air with a flow hood, and for our delivered capacity calculations, you are allowed to use the sum total of the supply measurements if you use an accurate flow hood, and that's described in the measurement document. This flow hood's not accurate enough for the total delivered capacity calculation. It works okay for balancing. I used it for years and then found a better tool and stopped. But the process is the same. In this picture, we're going around to each grill, measuring the airflow and adjusting it to match our targets.
Is he barefoot?
Gavin is barefoot in that picture. Someone asked if the gentleman on the left is barefoot, and he frequently is. I may or may not have photos of him barefoot on a roof. It's good that we're a little company and OSHA doesn't visit us frequently. Okay, cooling coil airflow. So 450 CFM per ton is our target for this program. Why? Does anybody not know why yet? Does anybody know why? Why do we do high airflow? The boulder just rolled all the way down the hill. Yeah, so we live in what is effectively a desert, right? Like, when's the last time it was 80 degrees and 80% humidity here? For more than about like 90 seconds, right? Like, there are weird humidity events, especially on the coast. But generally speaking, if it's hot out here, it's like 15% humidity, maybe 20. If it's cold out, it gets more humid and it even rains. Turns out that the actual weight of water per pound of dry air in California is roughly the same in the summertime and in the wintertime. If you get it cold enough, the air gets dense enough, the water comes out of the air. If you warm it up, the container of air gets really large because it gets to be low density and it feels really dry, right? And so how much dehumidification does it sound like we need to do with an air conditioner? Literally none, right? Like, we should not manage moisture with air conditioners. They use too much energy for that. You can do a continually operating bath fan with an ECM motor for like 8 watts and manage moisture in a house, right, in this climate. If we were in Louisiana, we would be having a different conversation, but we're not. And the way to do that in this climate is to raise the airflow compared to the amount of cooling capacity, because it makes the cooling coil warmer. And when the coil is warmer, you get less condensation on it. So we're literally trying to just deliver more heat to our air conditioning process so that we get less dehumidification. And 450 CFM per ton is on the low side of good for our climate. I routinely target 500 to 600 CFM per ton, and I have been over 600 CFM per ton, and I have occasionally been under 500 CFM per ton. So this is like a nice, safe entry point. Compared to what our industry builds, this is, you know, like crazy and hard to do, because we're still hanging out at like 280, 300 CFM per ton as an industry in California. I don't know why, but, well, I have some ideas. But we need for this program to get to 450 CFM per ton and 0.25 watts per CFM, which is, my brain has trouble with the math that way, 250 watts per 1,000 CFM, right? So pretty low fan energy consumption. And we get there by doing things like sizing our ducts properly and stretching them. There's this really great study done by Texas A&M. When you install a duct like that, it has really low airflow performance. And when you install a duct like this, it has almost identical performance to a piece of smooth steel duct at the same size. Right? All we have to do is pull them tight, and they work really well. Oh yeah, and so remember before when I said I didn't know why we have low airflow? Turns out that one of the things that we found in a research study three or 4 years ago was that of the 80 homes, the new homes they went out and sampled, they pretty much all had undersized returns, every single one of them. And then they went out and just upsized the returns, corrected the airflow, and corrected the charge, and they got 10 to 15%, probably more like 10% more delivered capacity at each of those sort of case houses than they had gotten as it was built by code, just by correcting the return, which raised the airflow, and then correcting the charge to match. 10% boost. We have a program here that's struggling to justify itself, and we're still building stuff where we get a gimme by just fixing the return. Right? Like, we should stop. Ducts work better when they have metal elbows anywhere they turn, turns out, right? Flexible things kind of kink when you bend them. So what you can't see in this photo is that there's a metal plenum with a metal takeoff with a metal elbow and then duct pulled tight against it. And there's a damper in that assembly someplace, right? The orange flags are dampers. And so, and then of course we insulate it for conduction. But this dramatically raises your airflow, right? And how many systems are still going in with just the duct sort of folded over at the boot, right? Constantly. Anytime we turn the duct, you need to use a metal elbow. And it says that in this program someplace. Fortunately, I already sort of beat on this a little bit, right? Sizing for the program is at these metrics. You need to do a load calc, manual J specifically required. And if manual J says that you can't meet these targets for the house, then don't submit the house or change the building enclosure, right? Like there's no, well, it doesn't work and I want my money, right? Like you've got to make it work. And the way you make it work is optimize the HVAC system, and then if you want the house to be a candidate, the homeowner has to agree to some building enclosure improvements, and if they won't, that's okay. But they don't, you know, this house doesn't go. And those are conservative. Those aren't hard. That we can do this on just sort of typical buildings. They don't have to be incredible buildings to pull this off. This is a fan watt draw. So that's just one leg of a 220 system. So I'm at 108 watts. Oops. And I'm at 884 CFM. And so I almost hit 8 CFM per watt. When you calculate it the way the program is using it and code does it, we're at 0.12 watts per CFM. And it's actually not very hard to do this. You have to keep your static pressure low. and then it's big. This is where it gets a little weird, right? I keep saying smaller, smaller, smaller. Turns out big fans turning slowly are way more efficient than small fans turning quickly. So ideally, if you're not using a furnace, you would do something like use a 3-ton air handler and a 1.5 ton condensing unit, or a 2-ton condensing unit. The fan is designed to move a lot more air than the condensing unit requires, which means you can set it on a lower tap setting. The RPM of the fan actually slows down, and the efficiency of the fan blades is increased. You get more air moved per unit of energy with a big fan turning slowly. And the HRI matching process is so strict that you can't go crazy. You can't do like a massive air handler and a tiny little air conditioner. We can usually do a 1/2 ton or a 1 ton mismatch, and we should in our climate. So this is a 2-ton air handler, or a 2.5 ton air handler, I think, and a 2-ton outside unit. So it's only maybe a 1/2 ton mismatch. There wasn't a specific charge requirement in the program rules, right? If you think about that spreadsheet, because you have, perfect picture memory and you can visualize exactly what it says. Nowhere in there does it say charge must be some number, but you're not going to get your output calculation right unless we get Superheat and Subcool correct. Code's been funny about these. What is the range of acceptable superheats for equipment according to the code verification? It's like 4 to 23 or 3 to 26 or something like that. So what does superheat mean? Does anybody know? Because this is actually more important than the number. Temperature after boiling. And so so you want a superheat to be between 5 and 10, right? So not a lot of temperature rise after boiling. So if I have a lot of temperature rise after boiling, what happened? Just don't think too much. It's a really simple answer. Something added heat after boiling, right? And the least effective way for us to move heat is by changing the temperature of something without changing its state. Like boiling refrigerant absorbs a ton of heat. Changing the temperature of boiled refrigerant or boiled water doesn't really take much heat at all. And so if you have a system that comes back with high superheat and it passes code and everybody goes home happy, you can be leaving 10% delivered capacity on the table. Because what that actually means is you have this coil with boiling refrigerant in it, and you have literally too much surface area that's not under phase change. And so you're giving away like super important real estate for air conditioning. If you get superheat down where it ought to be, you're maximizing the efficiency of that process, right? And your compressor watts barely change. Like there's not a big penalty for running more fluid through. You'll see a small change in watts and a big change in BTUs, right? And there's nothing in code that makes us do it. So what do? We don't do it, right? So superheat of 5 to 10, unless the manufacturer says clearly you have to do something else, and I've never seen that. So I think I probably just said everything that's on this slide. Obviously, we're doing higher efficiency equipment, so it's going to have a TXV. Subcool is required by code. We want that to be as low as the manufacturer will allow. Subcool is basically a measure of back pressure against your compressor. So the higher it gets, the more pressure you have against the compressor and your watt draw goes up. So subcool on the low side of your targets, superheat on the low side of the manufacturer's target, and you get more capacity. And we should commission furnaces too. Does anybody do this? Actually measure O2, CO2, temperature, gas pressure, all of that stuff. National Comfort Institute is not a great organization for getting coaching about like how to do an energy efficient building, but they are a great organization when it comes to like understanding the combustion process. They have a really good class about that. I think is possibly the best class available for figuring out how to commission a furnace. So I would look at it. So this is that last thing I said earlier in the review of code buildings. We were at something like 55% of delivery. If it's supposed to be 4 tons of capacity. At design conditions, we're getting like 2¼ tons or something, right? We're getting a little more than half of the capacity to the house, and the reasons are high duct conduction, high duct leakage, and low airflow, right? Like it's embedded in what we're trying to change, why this is happening. And so the people who are really good at this at design conditions have had systems over 90% delivery capacity. We're not asking for that. 85% is what we're asking for. And I think with furnaces, it might have to be 85% of whatever the output is, because if you commission the furnace, there's not much you can do about the 4% that gets lost in the combustion process. So for furnaces, we're going to have to figure something out. But for heat pumps and air conditioners, 85% delivered capacity is the target. And if your equipment is big, is this harder or easier? You should be noticing a theme, right? It's harder. Why is it harder? Think about the temperature of the air in the duct. If you're using a large heater or a small heater, is the temperature of the air in the duct likely to be what? Right? Like small heaters should be not quite as hot as a big heater. If you do the math for figuring out temperature loss or temperature sort of travel through a material, the variables are the insulation value or the heat transfer value, so U value or R value, the size of the surface, and the temperature across the surface. And so if you run a smaller heater for a longer period of time, you lose less energy through the duct system than a bigger heater. There is some variable that changes it based on run times, but it turns out that heaters in the size range we're talking about still cycle at design days. They don't run flat out. So it's not like this one runs 50% and the other one runs 100% of the time, which is what we used to say. Turns out that properly sized heaters and air conditioners cycle on design days. So nothing is running full time, unless you really downsize, in which case you can make that happen. I have a system at my house that's 50% of design, and at design conditions it doesn't shut off, right? But it's 50% of the load calc. And I'm not suggesting that you do that unless you want to. Turns out my house is super comfortable. This is what your sort of first time might look like if you're not used to trying to work against these metrics. This company was selected because they were turning in a lot of jobs. The owners wanted to do this, at least they said they wanted to do this, and they went out and looked at their jobs. And the red marks are all the things that, it was just like grading a school paper, right? You got to change this, you got to change that. And so I think it can be a little daunting, but if you decide to wrap your head around this, I think you can make the change pretty quickly. None of these concepts are new concepts, right? Like the information about how to meet these criteria all exists already. I think that it requires some kind of change all the way through a company. And the reason that I say that is when I do these classes, I get, well, we can't do load calcs, it'll cost too much money. Okay, code says you have to do a load calc, by the way, right? So not doing one is actually breaking the code rules. I want to say breaking the law, but people get upset about that. So, right, the rules say you have to do a load calc. They actually don't say you have to follow it. They clearly say you don't, but they do say you have to do it. Okay, so we're just saying do a useful load calc that's already required by the rules. And so, the other one is, well, I'm never going to get my salesman to sell equipment this small. And then I always go back to, don't they work for you? And I get that the employee-employer relationship is complicated, but at some point, you could figure out these guys need to get paid, or girls, and they should be selling something that you want them to sell. Right? Like there's got to be a way to get from here to there, and I'm not saying it's simple, easy, and that there's no stress involved, but it's just too, we can't just kind of hang up our hats. And then it changes design, and it changes install, and it changes our commissioning practices. We're talking about really changing the culture of a company. Like I've only ever done 2 rebate jobs in the history of my company, and I have no idea what my realization rate is. It might suck. I don't know. I got one customer, $7,000. I got another one, $5,000. They were happy. I did the job that I thought was a good job. But they meet all these criteria on all of my job, which means that there are some jobs that I don't take and I'm a small contractor, so I have the luxury of not taking some jobs. And I realize that for some people, you're going to take jobs that you can't access all of these metrics for. But it becomes a question of like, when is it okay to sell a job that has really bad airflow? Because the customer doesn't, like at some point, I'm willing to say no way sooner than a lot of companies will say no, and that's in part because of my company, right? Like I'm not trying to be judgy about that. But there should be some point where you say no. And so some of these metrics should just be normal, right? And that's kind of what some of you said in the beginning. We've adopted some of these practices and other ones we're working on. So we have some money for training. You've got about, like if one of us came out to your site, you have the equivalent of about 5 days of time. And that's not a lot in a way, right? Like, so this really got to be a company decides they want to do these things and they're looking for support, whether it's coming to the PG&E classes. Like I do this whole talk for a whole day, right? And we can talk about all of this stuff and you can ask all the questions you want, right? And, pursuing whatever other opportunities there are to sort of fill in the blanks for your company. And then on top of that, between what the company has to kick in and what PG&E will match, we can be on site for 5 days. And of course we can come longer, it's just at 5 days PG&E stops matching, right? And then there could be a little variation. Like if you want me to go to Arizona, it's probably not 5 days because I'm working against a solid dollar amount. But we'll talk about what we can do and how the best way is to do it for each company and try to get a plan together that works. Ultimately, you guys have got to drive the process though. Right? Like you've got to actually, that was the problem with the company with the red marks. It turned out that they were not driving the company to be different at all, right? They wanted to, so long as they didn't have to do anything different. You guys have to be making a committed effort to hit these marks and then we can help. I think that's where we're at.
What about if there's a couple companies that want to get together and do this?
So the question was, what if there were multiple companies who want to try to do this together? I suppose that is reasonable. The more people in the room, the more difficult it will be. So, yeah, I wouldn't say no. I would try that. I get paid whether or not you succeed, and I will try like hell to make you succeed, but ultimately that's not my choice, right? And so if people don't succeed because they weren't committed or because they made the process too hard, and they fail, they still have to pay me, right? Like, so figure out what the balance is. Like a couple of companies that were really committed and worked well together, sure. A couple of companies that are just watching dollars, probably not. But I'm into it. I'll try. Oh, cool. Do package units come into play? 70% of homes that are doing change outs in our area are package units which do not meet the AFU standards you're asking for. So no. And this is a change. So no, it won't qualify if it can't. If its AFU is lower than the delivered capacity we need, it's by virtue of just that alone, it doesn't comply with the intention of the program, and so we're not going to incentivize it. However, package unit systems are awesome. So you tear the package unit, assuming there's an attic or a crawl space or something. You tear the thing off the building, it leaves a big hole. You use that for access. You never have to destroy the interior of the home or do dust protection or any of that stuff. You go in and out through that hole. You build a nice system inside the attic or crawl space, then put a door on the hatch when you're done, and you could comply. But package units will never comply. They're low efficiency by virtue of having to waste a lot of heat so that their condensate doesn't freeze. So they can't do it. So that's a Build It Green question, Mike. And so the question is, in climate zone 1, AC is very rare. How do we get approved? I suppose it would be possible to do an approval that was conditional, and so you approve for heat systems, and then you'd have to go through a verification process if you submitted an air conditioning system later. There's got to be a way to make it work. Everybody's intention is to be able to get contractors to do this work, and I think people are committed to trying to figure out a path. So I think the answer is yes, and we don't know exactly what it'll look like yet. So that was your question, Mike. Do I have any other questions?
If the general contractor and the subcontractor are certified in this, does the general contractor automatically qualify for the incentive?
So that's, what's that? Oh, the question was, thank you, I've been reminded to repeat the question. Basically, who gets the incentive if a general contractor is running a job, the subcontractor is qualified for this program, and the subcontractor delivers the product on behalf of the general contractor? I have no idea, I'm not a program person.
That kind of scenario would be more of a, you as the general contractor, the participating contractor, you'd be submitting the work, you'd be taking part in the training so you understand what it is the subcontractor is actually installing. And as long as this is who you're using on those projects, it's potentially something you could do because they're, under the participation agreement, they're following the same program rules as you are. Now, we'd encourage them obviously to actually become participating contractors in their own right, but that's part of what you agree to when you sign up for the program.
So the GC and the subcontractor have to both be certified?
Yeah, basically you'd be training together. So if you're doing the sales process and stuff like that, your salespeople need to know. So if that's you, then you're involved in the training. You may not have to be involved in as much of it, but it would benefit you to see all of it end to end so that you know every step of the way. You understand the pain they go through to deliver on the installation requirements and the measurement.
More questions?
Anybody else have more questions? It can be for anybody who was speaking about program or technical stuff or whatever.
With the ducts, so if you can't get to one of the ducts because it's in the soffit, whatever.
It's the age-old question of it's beyond my control, it's in a wall, how do we, can it comply? And I think for this program, you either get it there or it doesn't comply. And, it might mean that it's actually ducted, it's not just a wall cavity, and you have to get the customer to pursue AeroSeal or, or something like that. Ultimately, leaky ducts don't serve the customer, the grids. Nobody wins in this scenario other than the fact that somebody bought a house and it has a bad thing in it, and nobody wants to say that we have to pay to fix it because that part sucks. I get that, but at some point we have to just say, we can't reward that because it's not a good call. And ultimately, the program folks can have a different answer because that is above my pay grade. But as I read this, that's where we're at.
Yeah, and I was just going to ask, David, how often is that the case? I mean, you work in San Francisco, so I understand there's a lot of old homes with, small nooks and crannies and whatnot.
Yeah,
So.
I think we come across that quite a bit. I think, as a single family rancher, obviously that's very easy to get to the 3%, but if it's not, and it's a two-story house with risers, we do, it can vary a lot, and there could be, and I've never had a client say, let's open up, I really want the leakage, I want to get to that duct, let's open up let's get knocked down that molding and get to that soffit, so you can access, they're like,
You suggest that to them.
Right, it becomes it's part of the sales process. San Francisco folks, I tend to work on their weekend houses up in Tahoe, and I
we
routinely
don't do
tell
molding.
them,
We don't, that to have my guys even touch that would be, you're not.
But I get that this is a difficult answer, but listen, follow me all the way through the logic. The customer doesn't want it to happen. You're nervous about doing it because of complexities with fixing plaster and the building, and your crew doesn't have that skill set. And those are all perfectly logical things to be thinking about. But the goal here is to improve the energy consumption of buildings, and none of what we just said has anything to do with that. Right? All the reasons we don't want to do it have nothing to do with why we're incentivizing people. And so it's not an illogical thing to say you can't get paid for that. It's actually perfectly logical to say we wouldn't incentivize that house. And then, how many of you really work on other solutions? We try really hard to abandon things that shouldn't be there and move ducts to new locations. And, and there'll be some cases where you can say, okay, look, none of this is any good. So we're going to do two systems. They're going to be tiny. There's one in the attic and one in the crawl space, and we're not reusing any of the old ducts. Right? And how many of those do we miss? Because what you're saying is true. There will be houses that you just can't get in this program for the budget that you have. But how many times did we just say, well, you know, that we want an allowance, and we didn't work through the whole process? And I don't know the answer for you, but we try really hard.
On the 3% to meet, is it specifically total leakage? We use the outside also?
This is total leakage. So the question was, can we use leakage to the outside? Can we use just total leakage? It just makes it not gameable, right? Like this thing leaks this much, and leakage to the inside is not like beneficial. It's just that we've used it to make things easier for people historically, right? And there's not much argument for it. And, you know, and while we're on this whole leakage thing, sell air quality. Leaky ducts in our environment are just delivering pollutants to people, right? Learn how to read some of the research about air quality, learn how to talk about that. There's a webinar question, then question in the back, and then question in the front. General consensus in the industry is to go to all-electric heat pumps. How are ductless mini splits looked upon? Can a gas furnace be removed and heat pump installed? I think we still have the fuel switching restrictions that we have always had. We can talk about those in another forum, and I will probably share your opinions. But that's the marketplace we work in, right? Like you and I and other folks don't get to make that change. And I know that people have worked on it, and there's been discussions that there might be change. Keep your fingers crossed. Question in the back.
I just had a quick comment about, you know, a lot of homes I go into have the furnace, you know, in a closet inside the living space. And should it be a general practice to either move it, you know, out of the living space into the attic or underneath, because you have, you know, giant combustion air vents above and below, and then we're in there trying to air seal, and you have a return grid 10 feet away, and everything else is air sealed, yet you have this furnace closet that was, you know, had an 80%er in there, they went to a 90 plus. Should it be a standard practice that they always plumb that combustion air vent down either to the sub area or to the attic, and then close off those combustion air vents so that, you know, you can get a better, obviously seal the house better, keep the conditioned air in, right? House is a system.
The beginning of that question that you may not have heard because I didn't get there fast enough was the example of a conditioning system inside the building enclosure in a closet with combustion vents through the building enclosure. And, you know, think about it like this. You're in a program where you can be rewarded for lowering the blower door number, and you can be rewarded for increasing the heating efficiency. And the only reason you didn't get both was the HVAC contractor only ran one pipe and didn't run a second pipe to outside. We're talking about like 25 to 100 feet of 2-inch PVC pipe, and your blower door number would have gone down by another couple hundred CFM, and the rebate would have gone up. The incentives are there because the building is better when it's more airtight, right? And the logic, like it blows my mind that we've been missing that one, right? Like it's crazy to put in a sealed combustion appliance and then leave a hole in the building enclosure. And so we should just not do that. And then in this particular program, somewhere it says sealed combustion appliances have to be both pipes to outside. So to comply with this metric, you have to do it.
Okay, we have one more question.
Oh, that was up front, sorry.
Yeah, or maybe Bill Green in general, are there any marketing pieces available for us to give to potential clients to kind of show them why these things are important? I mean, I can talk till I'm blue in the face sometimes and talk about bad indoor air quality, and they kind of look at me like really suspect, like I'm some sort of a snake oil dude.
I don't get to answer that one.
A few years ago, they had something, but it's kind of disappeared. It was like on us to do something, and I'm sure there's some sort of a professional marketing piece that we can use as part of our decision project.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some additional resources that we can work on for that. You know, part of what we're doing here is proposing some solutions, and exactly what that looks like is, you know, a little bit what's at issue, and once we finalize that, then that'll kind of determine what that looks like. I mean, we're going to produce some guidance on, being able to get customers to share their data. This is another thing we'd like to be able to do is provide you guys with some sort of leave behind or, like concise brochure that kind of runs through this, something as, visual as well as, not too much verbiage about it because people don't tend to process that effectively. So, yeah.
I'm gonna add on to that. We have been discussing at a program level that right now the customer, your general customer out in the marketplace right now has no idea that this even exists. They don't know what it is. And if we are going to take this standard and run with it, we have to take on the burden of creating that market, creating that education. So that's something we're discussing with PG&E. It's a big topic internally as to how are we going to bring high-performance HVAC to market so that your customers are calling you and asking for it. Taking that burden of you off of trying to sell it, having them actually meeting you halfway and going, oh, yes, please, over here, let's have some of that.
Probably have to sell it.
Yes. Okay, one last question, then we've got to move on.
Are you going to be putting a marketing plan together based solely on high performance initiative?
Yes.